My father said, "You'll figure it out, you always do," on a Wednesday afternoon in May. I had been standing in the small driveway of my parents' new condo with 3 of my kids in the back seat of my minivan. My mother had been holding a small mug of coffee. My father had been leaning against the open door of his garage. He had said the sentence in the casual voice he had been using on me my whole life when he had been about to dismiss something I had been asking about. I had asked him a specific question. The question had been why he and my mother had given the entire $286,000 from the sale of the house I had grown up in its entirety, to my younger sister Halia, while leaving me with nothing. The question had been polite. The question had been the 3rd time I had asked the question in 3 different ways over the previous 4 weeks. The first 2 times my mother had handled the deflection. The 3rd time my father had decided to answer. His answer had been 7 words. I had nodded. I had gotten back in the minivan. I had driven my kids home. I had not cried until I had been in the shower that night. What I want to tell you about is what happened 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in November, when the new owners of my childhood home had driven across town to my parents' condo with a small cardboard box. I want to tell you about what was in the box. I want to tell you because there are people listening to this who have a parent who has been dismissing them with the phrase, "You always do," for years, and who have been figuring out, in the small, quiet way you figure things out when nobody in your family is helping you, what it actually means that you have been figuring it out alone. I want to tell you what I learned from the box. Before I do, hit subscribe. And tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about a phrase one of your parents has used to dismiss your questions about unfair family decisions. Tell me what the phrase was. Tell me how many years they have been using it. I read every single comment. Now let me back up to the sale of the house because the sale is the foundation of what I am about to tell you. My name is Lyra Whitaker. I am 39 years old. I am a historian at a small regional museum in central Pennsylvania. I have 3 children. They are 9, 7, and 4. My husband, Adriel, is a high school physics teacher. We live in a small 4-bedroom house about 40 minutes from the town I grew up in. We are not wealthy. We are also not struggling. We are the kind of family that has been managing carefully on 2 modest salaries for the previous decade, who has not taken a real vacation in 5 years, and who has been quietly saving for our children's college funds in the small ways most public school teaching families save. My parents had sold the house I grew up in 8 months earlier. The house had been a small 4-bedroom craftsman that my parents had bought in 1984, 2 years before I had been born. The house had been the only house I had lived in until I had left for college at 18. The house had been the place where my younger sister Halia had also been raised, 4 years after me. The house had been, by the time my parents had decided to sell it, fully paid off and worth, in the small but stable real estate market of our town, somewhere around $290,000. My parents had sold it for $286,000. They had used the money to buy a small 2-bedroom condo about 6 miles away, for $140,000 in cash. They had given the remaining $146,000 to my sister Halia. I want to tell you about my sister because the giving had not been a one-time event. The giving had been the latest installment of a pattern. Halia is 35. She is the favored daughter. She has been the favored daughter for as long as I can remember. She had been the daughter our parents had spent more time with, more money on, and more energy worrying about. She had been the daughter who had been allowed to make a series of small and large mistakes throughout her adult life that I had not been allowed to make. She had been the daughter, in particular, who had been bailed out financially by our parents an estimated 11 times over the previous 15 years. The bailouts had varied in size. The smallest had been a $1,500 transfer to cover a security deposit on an apartment she had been moving into. The largest had been a $40,000 payment to keep her from losing her first house to foreclosure. The bailouts had been, in the way these things accumulate, the central financial activity of my parents' retirement years. Halia has 3 children, so do I. The 3 children Halia has are 9, 8, and 6. The 3 I have are 9, 7, and 4. The age overlap had been part of what had made my father's explanation so confusing. I want to tell you what my father had said in that driveway, beyond the 7 dismissive words. I had asked him why my sister had gotten everything. He had said, in the tone that had been his go-to tone for explaining family financial decisions, that Halia had been a single mother for the last 2 years, since her divorce, and that she had been struggling, and that my parents had decided to give her the proceeds to help her stabilize. He had then added the sentence about me figuring it out. I had not pointed out in the driveway the small problems with his explanation. I had not pointed out that Halia had been receiving $40,000 of child support per year from her ex-husband, and an additional $20,000 from her parents through informal transfers, and that she had been making roughly $70,000 at her job at the regional sales firm where she had been working since 2018. Halia had been earning, when all the inputs had been combined, about $130,000 a year as a single mother with 3 children. I had been earning $58,000 at the museum. Adriel had been earning $63,000 teaching physics. The two of us had been raising 3 children on $121,000 combined, which had been $10,000 less per year than my sister had been working with by herself. I had not said any of this to my father. I had let his explanation stand. I had driven home. I had cried in the shower. I had spent the next several months processing what had happened in the small, careful way I had been processing things in my family for most of my adult life, which had been quietly and without telling anybody. I want to tell you about my grandmother Edith because the rest of the story does not work without her. Edith had been my mother's mother. Edith had died in 1998 when I had been 12 and Halia had been 8. Edith had lived with my parents in the house I grew up in the small back bedroom that had been her room for the last 4 years of her life, after her health had begun to fail and my mother had decided she should not be living alone. Edith had been a careful, observant woman. She had been the kind of grandmother who had paid attention to me in a way the rest of my family had not. She had been the only adult in my childhood who had not been actively favoring my sister. I had been her favorite. I want you to know this. The favorite had not been a performance. The favorite had been the small, daily way Edith and I had organized our relationship. She had taught me to play backgammon. She had let me sit on her bed and read while she had been crocheting. She had told me, on several occasions in the last year of her life, that I was the granddaughter she had been most proud of, and that I was going to be the kind of woman she had been hoping to see in the next generation of our family. Edith had died of pneumonia in February of 1998. She had been 83. Her funeral had been small. My parents had handled all the arrangements. I had been 12. I had not been involved in any decisions about her possessions, her papers, or her small estate. Halia had been 8. The two of us had been told at the funeral that Grandma had not left a will and that everything she had owned had been minimal anyway. We had accepted the information. We had been children. We had not pushed. I want to tell you what was actually in my grandmother's estate because the actual contents had been buried, for 26 years, in a box in the basement of the house I had grown up in. The basement of the house had been mostly used for storage. My parents had been the kind of people who had kept everything. The basement had been packed by the time they had sold the house, with 60 years of accumulated objects, papers, holiday decorations, old children's clothes, my grandfather's tools, and several large boxes labeled in faded Sharpie with terms like tax stuff, and Edith things, and old photos. My parents had told me, when they had been preparing to move into the condo, that they had been overwhelmed by the basement. They had told me they were going to sort through it slowly and would let me take any items I wanted. They had then, in the small, careless way some couples sort through 6 decades of storage, simply pushed almost everything to a small alcove at the back of the basement, had taken the few items they had wanted, and had left the rest for the new owners to deal with. The new owners had been a young couple named Mia and Brennan Halloran. They had bought the house with the explicit understanding, included in the closing documents, that whatever had been left in the basement would become their responsibility. They had agreed. They had not particularly minded. They had been planning to clean out the basement themselves over the course of their first year in the house. Mia Halloran had been the one who had found the box. She had been working through the alcove on a Saturday afternoon in October, 5 months after she and Brennan had moved in. She had been sorting through old boxes and had been making careful piles of items that should be donated, items that should be thrown out, and items that looked like they might have personal value to my parents. The box she had found in the alcove had been labeled, on the side facing the wall, in handwriting that had been different from my parents' handwriting. The handwriting had been my grandmother's. The label had said, in the small, careful script Edith had used on letters and cards for 40 years, "For Lyra, when she is old enough." Mia had not known who Lyra was. She had thought at first that it had been a previous owner of the house. She had set the box aside on her workbench. She had finished sorting that section of the alcove. She had been planning to ask my parents about the box the next time she ran into them at the post office or the grocery store, which had been the small ways former owners and new owners stayed loosely in touch in our town. That evening, after dinner, she had decided to look inside the box. She had wanted to see if it had been the kind of box that should be returned, or whether it had been the kind of box that had been forgotten by everybody for so long that the contents would not matter to anybody. I want to tell you what was in the box because the box is the part of this story that changed my family. The box had been a small wooden box, about 12 inches by 14 inches by 8 inches deep, with a hinged lid. The wood had been cedar, the hinges had been brass. The box had been the kind of small, careful box that you knew, when you saw it, had been put together by somebody who had wanted the contents to be safe. Inside the box, in order from the top, had been the following items. A folded letter written by my grandmother Edith, dated November of 1997, 3 months before she had died. The letter had been addressed to me. The letter had been 4 pages long. The letter had been written in her careful script. Underneath the letter had been a smaller envelope, sealed, marked official documents in my grandmother's handwriting. Underneath the envelope had been a small leather pouch that had contained 3 of my grandmother's pieces of jewelry. A pair of small gold earrings that had been her own grandmother's. A small filigree pendant on a thin gold chain. A silver bracelet she had worn every day for the last 20 years of her life. Underneath the leather pouch had been a small bundle of photographs, tied with a piece of green string, that had been pictures of my grandmother and me from the years I had been ages 5 through 12. There had been about 40 photographs. I had not seen most of them before. Mia had read the letter first. The letter had begun, "My dear Lyra, if you are reading this, you are old enough. I do not know how old you will be by the time this box finds its way to you. I am hoping it will be by the time you are 25. I am leaving it in our basement, in a place I have asked your grandfather Cornelius to remember, with the expectation that he will tell you about it when the time comes. If he forgets, or if something happens to him before you are old enough, the box will eventually be found by somebody else, and I am hoping that somebody else will be the kind of person who follows the instructions on this letter." Mia had been crying by this point. She had told me later, when we had sat at her kitchen table together for the first time, that she had not been able to read the letter through the first time without stopping to call her husband over to read it with her. The letter had then explained that my grandmother had been planning to leave me a specific inheritance, which she had not told my parents about, because she had been worried that my parents would have spent the inheritance on Halia. My grandmother had been 40 years old when my mother had been born. My grandmother had been a careful woman with a small career in education that had ended when she had married my grandfather in 1939. My grandmother had been quietly investing small amounts of her own money, in conservative ways, for the previous 50 years, in a series of savings bonds and certificates of deposit that she had been keeping in the box. The sealed envelope contained, when I had eventually opened it, the documentation of those investments. The total face value, at the time my grandmother had been writing the letter in 1997, had been $46,000. The bonds had been held in my grandmother's name, with me listed as the sole beneficiary in a small payable-on-death arrangement my grandmother had set up with her bank. The bonds had been continuing to accrue interest for the previous 26 years. The current value of the bonds, when I had eventually had them appraised by a financial advisor, had been approximately $183,000. I want to tell you what Mia did with the box, because the doing had been the part of this story I have been most grateful for. Mia had not gone to my parents. She had been a careful woman. She had read the letter. She had understood, from the letter, that my parents had been the people my grandmother had been specifically trying to protect the inheritance from. She had decided, on her own, that the box should not be returned to my parents. She had instead spent the following Sunday afternoon looking through the small file of paperwork the previous owners had left in the kitchen drawer of the house. The file had contained, among other things, an emergency contact card for the previous owners. The card had listed my parents' names and phone numbers, and had also listed 2 adult children, Halia and Lyra. The card had included our addresses and phone numbers. The previous owners, my parents, had filled out the card at the closing without thinking about it, in the routine way new homeowners fill out paperwork. Mia had called me on the Sunday evening. She had been gentle on the phone. She had told me she had bought my parents' old house. She had told me she had found something in the basement that had been addressed to me. She had asked me whether I could come over to the house the following Saturday to pick it up. She had told me she had thought it was important. I had told her yes. I had driven over the following Saturday. Mia had met me at the door. She had walked me into her kitchen. She had set the box on the table. She had told me she had taken the liberty of reading the first letter because she had been trying to figure out who Lyra was, and she had been sorry if she had overstepped. She had told me she would leave the room while I read it. I had asked her to stay. I had read the letter at the kitchen table. I had cried for a long time. Mia had sat across from me and had held my hand for most of an hour. I want to tell you what I did next because the doing has been the work of the previous 6 months. I did not immediately confront my parents. I had been tempted. I had decided with Adriel's help that I needed to first secure the inheritance before I had any conversation with my family about what had happened. I had taken the box to a financial advisor on the following Monday. I had taken the sealed envelope and the bonds inside. I had explained the situation. The advisor, a careful older man named Mr. Theodoros Volkov, had reviewed the documentation. He had told me the bonds had been properly registered with me as the payable on death beneficiary. He had told me my grandmother had been clear about the arrangement. He had told me I had the legal right to collect the funds, given that my grandmother had passed away over 25 years earlier, and given that I had the original documentation in my possession. The collection had taken about 3 months. The bonds had been spread across several different financial institutions. Mr. Volkov had walked me through each redemption. The funds had eventually been consolidated into a single account in my name. The total had been $183,422. I had then, with Adriel's input, made decisions about what to do with the funds. We had put $80,000 into our children's college fund, $20,000 each. We had put $50,000 into a small home renovation that we had been deferring for the previous 8 years, because our small house had been in need of repairs that we had not been able to afford. We had put $30,000 into a high-yield savings account as an emergency fund, which we had not previously had. We had put the remaining $23,000 into a small fund that we had named after my grandmother, that we had decided to use to help fund summer camp scholarships for kids in our town who could not afford them. The fund had given out its first scholarships this past summer. 4 kids, $2,300 each. We had been the funders. My grandmother's name had been on the small certificate each kid had received. The renovation has been completed. Our small house is now solid. We did not tell my parents about the inheritance. I want you to understand why. I had decided, in the small, careful way I had been making decisions for the previous 6 months, that I was not going to tell my parents what had happened. I had several reasons. The first reason was that the inheritance had been my grandmother's specific gift to me, and my grandmother had been very clear, in her letter, that she had not wanted my parents to know about it. The second reason was that telling my parents would have likely resulted in them finding ways to involve themselves in the funds, possibly by suggesting that I share with Halia, possibly by asking me for loans, possibly by trying to retroactively justify the decision they had made about the house. The third reason was that the inheritance had been the small material proof in my own life that somebody in my family had loved me specifically, and had been thinking about me carefully, and had been planning for my well-being for years in a way my parents had never planned for me. The proof had been precious. The proof had also been private. The proof had not been something I needed to share with people who had spent 40 years being the opposite of that kind of family. My parents do not know about the box. My parents do not know about Mia Halloran. My parents do not know about the bonds. My parents do not know about the renovation because the renovation had been small enough that it had not been visible from the outside of the house, and they had not visited us in over a year by the time it had been completed. My parents do not know that my grandmother had set up a specific inheritance for me in 1997, and that the inheritance had been quietly waiting for me, in a cardboard box in their basement, for 26 years. I want to tell you what has happened in my relationship with my parents in the 6 months since I had collected the inheritance. The relationship has been distant. The distance has not been because of any single confrontation. The distance has been because, after the driveway conversation in May, I had decided I was not going to keep being the daughter who pretended that the dismissive 7 words had been acceptable. The distance has been small and consistent. I have not visited as often. I have not called as often. I have been polite. I have not been warm. My parents have noticed. My mother has called me twice to ask whether something had been wrong. I have told her both times that I was busy with the kids and that I had been distracted. The first time she had accepted the explanation. The second time she had been quieter. She had said, in the small voice she sometimes uses when she has begun to suspect something she does not want to confirm, that she had been worried about me. I had told her she did not need to be worried. The distance has been my version of the response. The distance has not required a single confrontation. The distance has not required me to tell my parents what I had found in the basement. The distance has been the small daily withdrawal of access that I had been giving them for 40 years, that they had been taking for granted, and that they have been now slowly noticing has been less available. Halia has noticed too. She has called me 3 times in the past 6 months. The calls have been awkward. Halia has not been able to articulate what she has been feeling. Halia is, I think, beginning to understand that the financial favoring she has been receiving from our parents for 15 years has been costing her something that the money had not been able to compensate for. The something has been my relationship with her. We had been close, in the small ways sisters with overlapping children can be close, until the house sale. After the house sale, I had not had the energy to maintain the closeness. Halia has been figuring out slowly that the gift our parents had given her had cost her her sister. I do not know what Halia is going to decide to do with the figuring out. I have been letting her work through it on her own. I am open to a different relationship with her eventually. I am not currently building one. Mia Halloran and I have become friends. I want to tell you that because the becoming has been one of the small, unexpected gifts of this entire situation. Mia has been 41. She has 2 young children. She is a nurse. Her husband Brennan is a carpenter. We have been having coffee about once a month. We have been talking about the renovation of her house, about my work at the museum, about her work at the hospital, about our children. She has become the kind of friend I had not been actively looking for but had been needing without realizing it. She has been, in a small, specific way, a witness to what had happened in my family. The witnessing has been a quiet form of validation. The validation has been more useful than I would have imagined before I had received it. I want to tell you what I have learned because the learning has been the foundation of everything I have been thinking about for the past 6 months. The first thing I have learned is that the parents who have been telling you for years that you will figure it out have not been giving you a compliment. They have been issuing a permission slip. The permission slip has authorized them, in their own minds, to continue to not help you, to continue to favor your sibling, to continue to use your competence as an excuse for their own neglect. The permission slip has been the small linguistic tool they have been using to make their behavior look like a recognition of your strength, rather than what it actually is, which is the abdication of their parental responsibility. You can figure it out. You always do. You have been figuring it out since you were a child. The figuring out has been the work of a lifetime. The work has not been a gift. The work has been the consequence of the absence of help. If somebody in your family has been using the phrase, "You'll figure it out," on you for years, please consider that the phrase has been a tool. The tool has been protecting them from having to actually parent you. The recognizing of the tool is the beginning of the end of its power over you. You can keep figuring things out. You can also stop performing the figuring out for them in a way that makes them feel comfortable about not helping. The not performing is the small daily protest you owe yourself. The second thing I have learned is that the people who have been loving you carefully, behind the scenes, have sometimes been doing it in ways you will not know about until after they have died. My grandmother Edith had been planning for me for at least 3 years before she had died, in a way nobody in my family had known about. She had been doing it because she had been seeing, with clarity I had not had at 12, what my parents had been going to do with my future. She had been protecting me. She had been protecting me in the only way she had been able to, which had been the slow, careful accumulation of savings bonds that she had hidden in a wooden box in the basement of a house she had not even lived in. The protecting had been her love. The love had survived 26 years in a box. The love had been there when I had been 12, when I had been 20, when I had been 30, when I had been 39. The love had been waiting. If you have a grandparent who has been quietly paying attention to you, please consider that the paying attention may turn out, after they are gone, to have been more than you understood it to be in the moment. The understanding can come decades later. The understanding can change everything. The grandparents who pay attention quietly are doing some of the most important work in our families. The work is sometimes only visible after they are gone. The visibility is the gift they leave us. The receiving of the gift, when it eventually arrives, is what reorganizes our understanding of who we have been, and who has been loving us, and what we have actually inherited from the families we were born into. The third thing I have learned, and the last one I want to give to you, is that the strangers who find the things our families have hidden from us are sometimes the most important people in our adult lives. Mia Halloran had not known me when she had found the box. Mia had been a stranger to me. Mia had been the new owner of a house I had grown up in, who had been doing the kind of careful, slow work that some new homeowners do, of sorting through the previous owner's abandoned things. Mia had read the letter. Mia had decided, on her own, that the letter had been more important than the convenience of returning the box to my parents. Mia had called me. Mia had brought me into her kitchen. Mia had held my hand while I had read the letter. Mia had become my friend. The friendship had been built on a small, careful decision a stranger had made to do the right thing for somebody she had not yet met. The doing of the right thing by strangers is, I have come to believe, the small, quiet engine that keeps the world livable. Most of us will not have the family we were born into. Most of us will need, at some point, the help of a stranger who decided, for reasons of their own that have nothing to do with us, to do the right thing in a moment that mattered. If you are at a point in your life where you are losing faith in the families we were born into, please consider that the strangers exist. The strangers are out there. The strangers are sometimes about to find the box your grandmother left for you, and to call you, and to bring you into their kitchen, and to become the friend you had not known you had been needing. The strangers are real. The kindness is real. The kindness is the foundation of any life that turns out to be worth living, on the other side of the family that did not love you the way you needed to be loved. The kindness is what we owe each other. The owing is what makes us a community, instead of a collection of damaged children pretending we are not damaged. The kindness is the small repair we can do for each other. Find the strangers, be the stranger, pass the box along when the box comes to you. The box is always going to keep coming. The box is what we are all carrying in different forms for the people in our lives we have not yet met.